Hey, thanks for being with us at Renovation Midweek. We're so glad that you're here. I hope you're excited to get into some worship, some word, and then some Q&A as we dive into it later. Let's go ahead and jump on in.
To you, Lord, you are worthy, and no one can worship you for me. For all the things you've done for me, and no one can worship you for me. Here's my worship, all of my worship. Receive my worship, all of my worship. Here's my worship, all of my worship. Receive my worship, all of my worship. And I will not be silent. I will always worship you. As long as I am breathing, I will always worship you. And I will not be silent. I will always worship you. As long as I am breathing, I will always worship you. Here's my worship, all of my worship. Receive my worship, all of my worship. Lord, here's my worship, all worship. Receive my worship. All my worship. Receive it all, God. Receive it all, God. Receive it all. So I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon the cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. 'Cause here's my worship, all of my worship. Receive my worship, all of my worship. Lord, here's my worship, 'cause I'll never know all of my worship. Receive my worship, all of my worship. 'Cause you, Lord, you are worthy.
Well, hey guys, I hope you are well this Wednesday evening. I am grateful to get a bit of time with you to continue our journey through the Psalms. I hope they have been as life-giving to you as they have been to me, to see some of these beautiful songs that particularly David wrote in times of great desperation in his own life, great trial, great uncertainty. And of course, you all are brilliant people, wise people. And so you know that these were not chosen without purpose. We, of course, find ourselves in a season of great uncertainty, a time for some of us of great despair, in need of a God who is present. And so how wonderful it is that we can look to the scriptures and look back generations even, predating Jesus, where David and other psalmists, but we've been focused on David, had such confidence in God, and that God, in his word, has delivered that confidence to us. So I hope you have experienced that in its fullness, and I hope it has been a blessing to you. Of course, we're going to work through the grid of the questions that we bring with us every time we come to the text, and those should appear in some succession on your screen there now, and hopefully you've written them down on a little note card as I shared with you all in earlier weeks. Today we're going to be in Psalm 16, and the heading of this psalm is a song of trust and security in God. Who needs a little bit of that right now? Certainly I do, and I believe that it is relevant for all of us. So if you want to get there, Psalm 16, we're going to read this together, and then we're just going to make a few observations. Who is God in this text? What provision is he making in this text? How is he interacting with the person who is addressing him and whom he is addressing? And how does this change our today and tomorrow? That's just a few questions that you might ask as we walk this out together. But let's read this beautiful song, starting in verse 1. Protect me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord, and I have no good apart from you. As for the holy ones in the land, they are the noble in whom I delight. Those who choose another God multiply their sorrows. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names upon my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You, Lord, hold my lot. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. I have a goodly heritage. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I keep the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore, my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. For you, O Lord, do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit. You show me the path of life. In your presence, there is fullness of joy. And in your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Quick prayer, and then we'll seek some insight here. Father, thank you for these words, these timely, relevant words. Would they do wondrous works in our hearts as we explore them together? We ask this in the matchless name of Jesus, in the wonder of the Father, and in the power of the Spirit. Amen. Psalm 16 is fascinating and beautiful. In fact, as we have discovered over the last several weeks, many times when facing difficulty, David speaks of God as his refuge. And here in verse 1 of Psalm 16, as we just read together, David very much follows the same pattern. Protect me, O God, for in you I take refuge. But what he does in Psalm 16 that perhaps we haven't seen in some of the previous Psalms that we've walked through together is he actually not only makes this claim that God is his refuge, but he develops through the remaining verses how it is that one might take refuge in God and what such refuge provides. This is very, very important because there are times where perhaps we have the ethereal grasp of an idea. Yes, God is our refuge, or as we saw last time, God is a fortress about us. But how do we actually appropriate that truth in our life? What does it mean to take on God as a refuge? And what does it mean that refuge is a provision for us? And what exactly does that refuge provide? Well, for David, to take refuge in God means to rely on him and acknowledge him as his sovereign. Now, what does that mean? Well, as generally self-reliant people, and I'll raise my hand and say a nearly perpetually self-reliant person. In fact, that is the thing I believe God has done the most work to work out of me. This flies in the face of our natural proclivities. It flies in the face of our cultural mores. It flies in the face of even how we are raised to think and believe in this nation, and dare I say, in much of the world. The idea that we would rely on another for anything outside of a quid pro quo, which means I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And so if I rely on you, it's because one day you'll get to rely on me, and I will feel that I have purposefully repaid what it is that you have accomplished on my behalf. So the idea of reliance is a very difficult one for us, isn't it? It's a very difficult one for us. And I would stretch the words of James just a little bit, where the Apostle James, and Jesus' brother, says, how can you love God who you cannot see when you can't love your brother who you can see? Well, how can we rely on a God whom we cannot see when we refuse in pride to rely on people who love us, who we can see, who are right in front of us? And so even though David defines taking refuge in God as total reliance on him, the hurdle is not in grasping the definition of what it means to take refuge. The hurdle would be actually allowing ourselves to fully rely on God for everything and treat him as sovereign in everything. So let's take it one layer beneath that. How do we learn to rely on God? Here's a few illustrative ways you can think about it. Why not pray before we make a decision rather than asking God to co-sign it on the backside? Why not actually seek God in every granular and minuscule aspect of our life and reality? Rather, as I have been, I won't speak for you, but as I have been, be frustrated when things don't work out the way that I hope that they would. Why not put ourselves in position to be in God's life-giving presence as frequently as we can, not out of guilt, but out of the great gain that it is to be in the presence of the living God. Those things cultivate reliance. When we don't treat God as an escape plan or a backup plan or a tab to pull only in case of emergency, but we treat him as an ever-present help, as a loving Father, as one who is not only in control of the world from a macro standpoint as the creator of the universe, but deeply and intimately and keenly desirous to be invested in our lives, both communally and individually. When we do those things, then we cultivate this reliance that David speaks of, which leads us toward the path of actually taking on God in totality as our refuge. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I hope it is helpful, because there is great reward in that. When we take on God as our refuge, we have the beautiful revelation that outside of him, there is no good for us in the world anyway. We have no good apart from him. Life doesn't taste the same when it is not seasoned, if you will, with the presence of the Spirit of God. Now, I know we are not all in the habit of seasoning our food, but the reality is that once you taste food that has been seasoned well, you can't go back to that blandness. Why? Because something truly transformative has taken place. It'll never taste the same again. That is kind of the image that popped in my mind as I read this, is that in God there is such goodness that once I have tasted and seen, let's put another psalm in there, that the Lord is good, nothing else without him will ever bring the same delight again. Once you've had an extraordinary meal, it is very hard to have a subpar meal and not compare it to the one that preceded it, and it will never be the same again. And that is what life tastes like outside of intimate communion with the living God. This is why the psalmist says in verse 4 that those who choose another God multiply their sorrows. They multiply their sorrows. Why? Because there is no refuge for them. There is no hope for them in choosing to worship things that cannot satisfy, that cannot fulfill, that cannot protect, that cannot provide refuge, that are not sovereign, that are not in control, and at the same time keenly and intimately aware of every individual's emotional state and situation and needs and necessities. So the sorrows are multiplied from what? From seeking satisfaction in things that will never, ever satisfy. Does anybody relate with that? I certainly can. I certainly can. In fact, when I was still playing ball, it was one of the most more remarkable experiences that I had over and over again is seeing these men who had made it. They had all the wealth in the world, and yet they were still not happy. Or you watch, right? You watch people not be able to move away from the game. And I hope I don't become too heavily reliant on sports analogies or legal analogies. It's just kind of my world. But I hope this one would help and make sense. But it's what you see when you see a guy who just won't leave the game. Why? Because their whole identity, their deepest satisfaction is tied up in this other God. And because it never quite satisfies, it leaves a sense of sorrow that drives them back to try to find that same satisfaction from the same thing that will never satisfy, which is why it multiplies the sorrow. Because you feel the sorrow of the lack of satisfaction, but you go back to the thing that doesn't satisfy to try to be satisfied. And then when it doesn't satisfy, what happens? You're back in the cycle of sorrow and seeking false satisfaction. And that's what David has in mind here. Of course, he wasn't talking about money necessarily, or football, or fame, or some of the things that we look to in this era and in these days as false gods. In fact, he says there that these others worship these false deities by pouring out blood offerings, and that he's not going to do that. He's not going to allow it to touch their lips. So back then, there were people literally sacrificing animals and sometimes people to these false gods in an attempt to find a satisfaction that they would never find in the places that they were looking, multiplying their sorrows. And David says, I will never do that. Why? Because God, in whom I have all satisfaction, has given me the cup of blessing. So I don't have multiplied sorrows. I have multiplied satisfaction. Oh, somebody needs to get that real quick. When we seek to worship things that don't satisfy, our sorrows are multiplied. But when we take on God as our refuge, and take on God as our satisfaction, and take on God as our delight, well, then our satisfaction is multiplied. Our joy is multiplied. In fact, the psalmist says there at the end, though we will jump back to the middle here in a moment, he says right there at the end, with respect to our joy being multiplied, he says that in your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore. So we experience just the opposite of multiplied sorrows when we take on God as our satisfaction. We experience the cup of blessing rather than the drought of emptiness that is associated with chasing things that will never satisfy. The psalmist speaks of these things from experience, not ethereally. But God is his refuge, who he readily addresses, he says, has made his lot secure. What does that mean? It means that the darkest night may come. The most difficult times may surface. But God is still a place of security for him. God is his chosen portion. And God has his life in his hand. What does it mean for God to be our chosen portion? It's the same with the satisfaction analogy. It means that God will be the singular source of our greatest satisfaction. Everything else is secondary, tertiary. Everything else comes after. Everything else comes after. Whether we're single or married, whether we're wealthy or poor, whether we're right there in the middle, whether we're known or not, none of those things can compete with God being our portion if we are ever truly to be satisfied in this world. Now, the psalmist is so confident of this, of the benefits of God being his refuge, of the joy of God being his satisfaction and his source, his cup, that he knows that God will give him continual counsel. He knows that this security that God gives him will fill him with a joy that overflows. In fact, he says there in verse 9 that his soul rejoices, that his heart is glad, that his body rests secure. He knows that in the deepest trouble he might find himself, all he needs to do is reach out and the steadying hand of God will be there to take hold of his. That is what it means for God to be our refuge, our hope, our portion. That is what it means to hold the cup of blessing in one hand and the hand of God in the other. That is what it means to find multiplied satisfaction rather than chasing multiplied sorrows. And that is the fruit of the refuge provided by the living God. Now, as we kind of wrap our time here, we come to an interesting place in the text. And as you read it, perhaps it jumped out to you as it jumped out to me. But in verse 8, he writes, I keep the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. We just talked about that. The ability to reach out at any time and grab the steadying hand of God. No matter how shaky our reality is, God, that just hit my spirit. No matter how shaky our reality is, when God is our refuge, we can reach out and grab the steadying hand of God at any time. But he goes on in verse 10, and he says something strange. He says, for you do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit. Now, a little bit of ancient Near Eastern understanding here of the Bible. Sheol is the place of the dead. We don't have time to unpack all of that, but there's a passage in Luke that fascinatingly unpacks Sheol. And it's the story of Lazarus and the rich man. I encourage you to go and look at that and then connect that to Ephesians chapter 4, where in Paul writes that Jesus led up a host of captives in his ascent, after his descent, and after his death. So Sheol is the place of the dead. And here, David writes that God will not give him up to Sheol or let his faithful one see the pit. So essentially, David is writing, God's not going to let me die. Now, how is that possible? I mean, I have incredible confidence in everything that God does. Some days. Others, not so much. But the confidence to write that because God is my steadying hand, because God has placed the cup of blessing in my other hand, because God has drawn boundaries and lines for me that are pleasant. In other words, what David is saying is God has created a boundary around my life that produces pleasantries for me. Because God is my refuge, because I will not chase after false gods and multiply my sorrows, because in God I multiply my satisfaction, God's not going to give my soul up to the place of the dead. He's not going to let me see the pit. How is that possible? Well, you may find it interesting that generations later, the Apostle Peter, our favorite New Testament guy next to Jesus, would say in Acts 2, but David did in fact see the pit. He did in fact see corruption. He did, and by corruption meaning the decay of his body, he did in fact see death. So what did he mean when he wrote those words? Well, his words there in Psalm 16:10 go beyond what was fulfilled in his own body. They go beyond even the resurrection that he might experience at the last day. Verse 10 is a promise of something greater. In fact, the Apostle Peter said in Acts 2:30 through 32, being therefore a prophet. Remember, we talked a couple of weeks ago about David fulfilling these three offices that only Jesus ever fulfilled after him: prophet, priest, and king. So Here's one reference to David being a prophet from Peter himself. Said, being therefore a prophet and knowing, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, I believe is the address, that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, David foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of Christ, that Jesus was not abandoned to the pit, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus, Peter writes, God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. In other words, as this psalm of assurance and protection progresses, David moves from petition in verse 1, preserve me, O God, into I know you will be my refuge, and this is how you are refuge, into unshakable confidence by verse 8 and verse 9. And yet, he knew he would die. He knew he would lie in a grave eventually. But he also knew that one was coming, a descendant of his own family line that would put an end to death forever. And his body would not decay in the grave with his fathers. David knew that these two great facts, his own preservation, body and soul through death, and the triumph of Jesus, the Savior, over death, had to be connected. He just did not fully know how they were connected. But God gave him a revelation of that connection. And so David, in espousing his confidence in God's keeping hand over his life, saw forward incompletely to God's keeping hand over his promise to put one on his throne that would never see death. In fact, before death could swallow Jesus, Jesus destroyed death. And so David, with incredible confidence, speaks future forward. Yes, I will die here, but one is coming that will defeat death such that I can write with confidence that you, O Lord, will not give me up to the place of the dead, because my descendant will defeat death itself, such that those who find their satisfaction in you will find their satisfaction multiplied in having eternal life. Wow. And this is why there in verse 11, he rounds off this confidence song of trust and security by saying just that. You show me the path of life. You show me the path of life, both now and forevermore. You remove the fear of death from me, both now and forevermore. And for that reason, I know that I know there are endless blessings that come from the right hand of my God. And there are pleasant places and delights that come from his left. And in his presence is the fullness of joy, such that even in the midst of present problems, if God is my refuge, my cup, my portion, my delight, my satisfaction, then in his presence, no matter what is happening around me, there will still be a fullness of joy, a fullness of joy that will carry me forward from this reality and on to the next. My goodness, my soul is lifted from that truth. And I genuinely hope that yours would be as well. Father, would you seal this to our hearts now, that we might be confident in what it means to take you on as our refuge and experience all the blessings and benefits therein. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you.
Come thou fount of every blessing, tune thy heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, calls for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise a mountain fixed upon it, mount of God's unchanging love, yeah. So here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, he to rescue me from danger, oh, interpose his precious blood, interpose his precious blood, oh, interpose his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor, and daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy grace now like a fetter, and bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. But here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. Oh, here's my heart, Lord, take it, seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. Here's my heart, Lord, take it, seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above.
Hey, we're so glad that you worshiped with us today, and we want to extend that time of worship into a time of generosity. And I just want to thank you for your generosity. It's because of your giving that we as a church can continue to see the flourishing of God's people all around us, that we can continue to see the flourishing of the surrounding community, that we can continue to engage the community around us. So thank you for your giving and your generosity. There are several different ways that you can give. You can text to give, renovationchurch.com. And however way you're going to do it, I hope that you're doing it knowing that it is having a lasting impact on the surrounding community and people's lives. Thanks so much. Hey, thanks for joining us. It's that time to move to our live Q&A. I hope that you would join us, myself and Pastor Lance, as we dive a little bit further into your questions from tonight's midweek gathering, as well as some questions that might have surfaced during this time. You can find us over at our Instagram page at RenovationATL. See you in just a second.